It's Wizards versus Lesbians, a podcast for your ears. Hello and welcome to Wizards versus Lesbians. My name is Isaac.
I'm Alexis.
And today we are discussing Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu.
It is our retroest of retros.
Yes, this book was written in 1870-something.
Actually, I believe it was serialized over the course of a year between 1871 and 1872.
Carmilla was first published in The Dark Blue in 1871. There we go. All right, but we are actually specifically discussing an edition that came out much more recently, specifically in
2019.
Yes, with an introduction by Carmen Maria Machado.
An introduction, some very light editing, and also the occasional footnote annotation.
Yes, indeed. Would you like to do the plot, or shall I?
Well, okay. So Laura is your classic Gothic heroine. She's frail and beautiful and you know lovely and sweet, and then at some point she and her father end up with custody of this other young woman who seems lovely and sweet, but is dangerously obsessed with Laura and is also very obviously a vampire.
I think that pretty much covers it.
This actually predates Dracula.
It does indeed. So for some additional context, this book was written under a pseudonym. Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu doesn't exist, as you might expect, with a name that ridiculous. This book was in fact written by the author Emily Snutterbridge, who wrote it at the tender age of 15 and managed to get it published pseudonymously. What we know of Snutterbridge's life is largely comes from the research of Dr. Ann Blastowitz of UNC Chapel Hill, who was in the purpose of researching this sort of unknown author of the mid-Victorian era, who was apparently a big Jane Austen stan and also fond of doing sort of self-insert fiction. So it was a sort of a biographical sociological study of the phenomenon of self-insert fan fiction as it goes back to the 19th century. But unfortunately, Dr. Blastowitz died in a mysterious wakeboarding accident before she was able to complete her studies. So that's about all that we're going to know about Emily Snutterbridge until somebody takes up the cause. Okay, I'm lying. Just like Machado in her introduction. It's fun to be postmodern with your criticism. But I will guarantee that everything in the jingles is true, to the best of my knowledge. Seriously, though, tell me that Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu isn't a darkness dementia way type of name.
Indeed.
So the other thing about this is that our editor has invented a completely fictitious,
different, and honestly less interesting backstory for this book.
Yes.
Which we can get into that post.
We'll get into that when we get into that, but I wanted to establish that there was also some postmodern fuckery going on here.
Yes.
The tragic part of which is that in this introduction, she says a lot of mean things about the author, who is actually an extremely interesting person, but I had to go research that rather than just read this fucking critical edition. But anyway.
Well, this is not a critical edition.
It's not in the slightest.
So, okay. Are there wizards? Well, there are vampires. Close enough.
And lesbians?
Absolutely.
Yes, indeed, there are lesbians. There is a sort of a fun tension between attraction and horror in Maria here for her mysterious friend slash bloodsucker. I keep calling Laura Maria. This is not a postmodern joke. It's just a mistake, which is different because I'm dumb.
Yes, this is very much this really is the origin of. Presumably there's other stuff that predates it that was less interesting. But if you want your sort of predatory, obsessive lesbian stereotype, this is a pretty good early source text.
No, I mean, it would have been really valuable to know whether it is in fact an origin or a midpoint or a transition or anything, but that would have required the editor to do some research.
Again, I will note, this is not a critical edition at all. this is its own bit of, yeah, as you said, postmodern metatextual fuckery.
Yes. But regardless, if you want, there is actually a critical edition of Carmilla out there, which you can find. Yes. And you can also read the original unedited version for free online via the Gutenberg project of the story.
That's how I originally read this. And in fact, I compared a few things from the Machado edition and the Project Gutenberg edition.
As did I. And we can get into that later on in the discussion as well. As far as why should you read the story generally, and also why should you read this particular edition of the story?
Why should you read the story generally? I mean, if you read Dracula and thought what I would like is for this to be lesbian and have fewer characters and, alas, no Texans, then
sadly a lack of text.
A sad lack of Texans. No, I mean, the thing is that the writing holds up remarkably well for, especially for what it is. It's short. It's quite compelling if you like this sort of, gothic romance type genre. And, especially I think that the writer did a good job, and it's,
Absolutely. Particularly given that she was 15 when she wrote it.
Right, exactly.
And tragically, her life was also very brief. She died at the age of 26 of paroxysmic hysteria on the very day that Virginia Woolf was born. So that's a sort of interesting bit of historical trivia there. A contemporary account alleges that the real Le Fanu died of fright at the age of 58, by which they mean he had a heart attack.
That is a fascinating bit of historical trivia. Anyway, I feel like if you are at all interested in the history of lesbian literature or Gothic romance, or just you have like an hour to kill, I would recommend this. I had a lot of fun reading it both times that I've read it.
Yeah, it's a fun little story. As to why you should read this edition specifically, I don't think you should.
Yeah, actually, I was really disappointed. I'm
Me
generally
too.
a big fan of Carmen Maria Machado, and I was really disappointed. We can get more into why post spoiler zone, but
Indeed. Now, as to why you shouldn't read it, obviously there are going to be some of the values of the time
yes.
entrenched in this book, as Machado points out.
Though she misses a really obvious one, which I will plan to complain about post spoiler zone.
And also does not give any room for this to have potentially been a deliberate thing on the author's part, which I think there is some evidence of. But that's pretty much it. Like it's relatively sort of the horror is all off screen. It's a very sort of, suggestive rather than, over the top horror story.
Yeah. And I mean, it's got all of the things that you would expect of a vampire novel from this era in terms of like, vampires are basically just a bunch of different kinds of creepy consent violations.
Yes.
And so, but like, what you're getting into with this, I feel like. It is significantly less harrowing than Dracula.
Indeed. And much shorter also.
And much shorter, yes. I read the first little like quarter of Dracula, if that, when I was far too young, and I spent several years just completely terrified of vampires as a small child.
Yes. I also, interestingly enough, this is for all those Twilight complainers, this vampire is a sexy vampire and predates Nosferatu,
Right. No, this is very much, this is the, I believe the earliest vampire story we have published on that survived.
Okay, not even close. The first vampire story in English was written in 1819 by John Polidori, a friend of Lord Byron, and is generally thought to be about Byron, who most people would agree qualifies as sexy. But there were poems about vampires published as far back as the 1750s, and these themselves were a reaction to a series of incidents of popular hysteria in the 1720s and 30s, most of which took place in Habsburg, Austria. A Serb named Peter Blagojevich was exhumed and staked on suspicion of killing 9 of his fellow villagers post-mortem. And though I can't prove he was the ancestor of former Illinois Governor Rob Blagojevich, I have my suspicions.
So for all the people who like to complain about vampires shouldn't be sexy, I mean, I like a good, scary, non-sexy at all monstrous vampire, but we cannot ignore
There's a fine,
our history.
long-standing tradition of sexy vampires.
There is, because boy. Oh, actually, one reason why you should read this edition is I actually really enjoyed the drawings.
No, the illustrations are great.
There's some lovely, like, pen and ink illustrations in here that really fit the mood, really capture the story quite well. And, I thought that the artist, who's credited somewhere here, did a great job. Shout out to Robert Kryza.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. But having established all that, shall we move on?
Yeah! Oh
my God, we've finally made it to the spoiler zone. All right. So, in her introduction to this book, Carmen Maria Machado invents a sort of alternate historiography wherein this book was not sort of invented by the author, but was in fact based on letters from a real girl who had a real lesbian love affair with a real woman who was sort of a love him and leave him, I think like Spanish
demon
countess.
Lover type, yes.
Yes, who left a sort of a string of heartbroken suicides in her wake. She invents a sort of a string of academic, research into this, complete with fake academic, citations, which and a sort of a nice little ghost story about this this academic died early too,
which, as you point out, is also accurate to the real version. And this is an incredibly petty thing that I'm going to complain about real quick, which is that she does not quite nail the academic tone in the footnotes, which, I mean, is honestly fine because...
she's not really trying to.
She's not really trying... Right, exactly. She's not really trying to.
She's doing like 2 or 3 different conceits at once here. Because she's also, in addition to being like, I'm faking being the academic, she's also like, ooh, let me, show that I'm a better ghost story writer than Le Fanu by putting in my own little glosses here, which are so much more creative than what he came up with back in the 1870s.
And are generally not.
And are generally not.
Some of them are funny, but this is actually the big thing that she missed, which is that the peddler is so obviously a Jewish stereotype.
Yes.
Like, he's hunchbacked and dark bearded, and he's got, basically mezuzah scrolls. Like, he's got these little, like, curled vellum strips with Kabbalistic designs on them. And
right.
I am
and
deeply annoyed.
He's in Germany, but he can't really speak German or Spanish. He's
right, exactly. And so I am deeply annoyed that she makes him a Christian, like, who, is protected by the vampire because he just happens to be wearing a crucifix. Like, it's just a real obvious... Because... the selling point of this edition would be to have somebody, sort of embroidering on the original conceit, but like really, continuing and embroidering on the metaphorical content. And so completely and I feel like, this is the most egregious example, but I feel like there's several places where she's really misses, what's going on metaphorically in this story.
Yeah, so I'm gonna do a best case here. This is my best case because among other things, as part of her introduction, she brings up Lolita, right? Mm-hmm. And she then brings up a sort of a Nabokov scholar who was like, Lolita is a prisoner from the beginning. She's dead from the beginning. That's the sort of the feminist reading of this book, is that she's a plaything of the narrator Humbert Humberts from the entire beginning, because he controls her story from the beginning and encompasses her death from the beginning. But Machado misunderstands this and thinks that they're talking about the author of Vladimir Nabokov and not the narrator of Lolita. And I'm going to suggest that it's possible that this is a deliberate misunderstanding, because then what she proceeds to do to Fanu's story is a pale fire, i.e., she takes a. Have you read Pale Fire?
I have not.
So the conceit of Pale Fire is that this maniac, like, who's befriended a professor, takes the long poem that the professor wrote as the last thing that he did before he died, and publishes it as Pale Fire, but full of footnotes and like glosses, which basically do his best to make the poem about the weirdo's own vanished kingdom of Zembla, of which he is like a fail son prince.
I'm definitely going to have to read this novel.
Oh, Pale Fire is amazing.
I know, but the thing, you've tried to get me to read it in the past, but you never told me what it was about. You just told me that it was amazing. If you told me what it was about.
That's on me. I'm sorry. But she's sort of willfully trying to make this story more about, the specific issue that she has, which is reclaiming like lesbian stories and not, not burying our gays. And in the process, ignoring much of what the story is actually about, in a Pale Fire kind of a way. And so my best and most like generous reading is that she's giving us a little sort of wink nudge. Yes, I know I'm doing this, but I'm having fun, before she goes on and does the thing.
I mean, I would buy it. This one feels like less of a stretch than some of yours, partly just because that, that kind of wink nudge metatextual stuff is something that I feel like you see in Machado's fiction. So I mean, yeah, no, I'll buy that. And it's clear. I mean, it's clear that a big part of why she's doing this is just because she's got a name and a platform, and this is a way to reclaim some classic lesbian literature and get people reading it again.
Yeah,
and so
it gets it back into print.
Exactly.
Yeah, I would say that I would give the book credit enough for that. And also I feel like since this is sort of meant, I feel like this presentation is meant to skew toward younger readers, that it's sort of a fun, puzzle box that people can look into, like that younger readers can like look into and research on their own if they want to, and then they can find out all this other stuff. So that's my most generous reading of it. My less generous reading of it is that she is awfully mean to Le Fanu for no reason that I can see. Like she goes on in the introduction about like, his style of prose and his like, horrible overuse, his love affair with the superfluous comma is, I believe, the way that she says it. And, if you read her things side by side, like her edits are not so much.
Do not actually necessarily improve things. Occasionally, when I was comparing sentences, I was like, actually, the original flows just fine, and there's no reason to rewrite the sentence.
Yeah, it's just like sort of changing word order around and changing paragraph breaks for no reason that I can particularly see. It does. I mean, that feels kind of mean and pedantic, and like but she isn't like switching out the more sort of esoteric 19th century turns of phrase either. She isn't trying to modernize it, which I'm thankful for, because that would have been worse. But like it does sort of raise the question of why bother messing with the prose at all, because if you read the original, it's perfectly understandable. Yeah.
And yeah, I have no idea.
I don't know why to do that, except out of a sort of grudge against the author. I'm basing this mostly on all of her now deleted Twitter posts where she says that she hates both this specific Irishman and Irishmen in general. Luckily, I kept the receipts. No, you can't see them. Wait, I said that everything in these jingles was supposed to be true, didn't I? Except this one.
I don't know if it's necessarily a grudge. I mean, there is a real sense of playfulness with all of her, with her annotations, and which again are all fictional, and and with the introduction. And so I mean, the author is dead, in this case, literally, and as is the editor compiler. But it feels more just like somebody who, this is their chance to finally tweak all the, this is an MFA this is finally her chance to tweak all these little things that, are not how she would do it.
There is that.
I
think that if you let me loose on a piece of fiction like this, I might do something similar, but I shouldn't, is sort of my point.
When I became a professional editor, I really had to train myself out of doing that sort of thing. And a big part of it is, that part of my job as an editor is actually to help the writer's voice shine through more clearly and comprehensibly. And so even when I'm like, I could just rewrite this sentence and it would be better, it's usually like, why don't you rephrase this? Here's 3 different options, or you could choose your own.
Indeed. So let's look at the story itself.
Yes, let's, because it's actually, first of all, this is where there's a bunch of jokes in Pratchett's Carpe Jugulum about vampires rearranging their names, rearranging the spelling of their names. And I thought that this was a reference to like the, Alucard character who shows up in a lot of Dracula spin-off stuff. But no, it's Carmilla, whose name just keeps getting anagrammed as she, seduces other young women and, different guises over like 3 centuries.
Yeah, no, I was wondering if this was the origin point of the anagrammatical vampire convention.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Machado italicizes anagrammatically in her version when it's not italicized in the original, just to make sure that you notice that this is the origin point of that particular trope, or it might be the origin trope of that particular trope. I don't know. I don't have a critical edition to look at. But
yeah, now I want to read the critical edition.
Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that I do that really stood out to me is how deeply ambivalent the protagonist remains. She's clearly in love with Carmilla, and very attracted to Carmilla, and she's clearly put off by Carmilla's weird, creepy obsessiveness the entire time. And then after Carmilla is, exhumed and beheaded and staked and whatever, she remains sort of, this kind of ambivalent, which I think is an interesting choice, because it's not that, oh, she was seduced and completely fooled and then completely, and then like completely disgusted, eyes wide open. There's this just deep current of ambivalence that runs through the entire thing, which I thought was really well handled by the author.
Yeah, it's like, I think that, honestly, like, Machado invites us to sort of think about the sort of the film of moralism, with all of these, like, fathers and priests and vampire hunters who are keeping, shuffling around and keeping the truth away from Laura over the course of the book. I think that they're meant to be creepy, honestly. Like, I don't think that that's something that, I think that, like, if Le Fanu wanted this to be a moralizing text about the dangers of, lesbianism, I think he could have gone way harder with it. I think that he is not going to deny the erotic fascination of this for our hero. And yeah, no, it absolutely textually ends on an ambivalent note where she is not sure, looking back, whether to be horrified or nostalgic for Carmilla and her sort of feet upon the stairs. And an interesting note that I found when I was researching Le Fanu himself is that he wrote a novel called, hilariously, Spalatro, about a Italian bandit name of Spalatro, who himself was in love with a sexy female vampire.
So I'm sensing a theme here in Le Fanu's
Yes, no, this
work.
guy was clearly interested in sexy female vampires. And in fact, in Spalatro, the sexy female vampire is not all evil. She in fact tries to save, unsuccessfully, but tries to save the bandit's soul from his life of crime. So, you know, I
So
think that
yeah,
I think
this
the author himself has some interesting ideas about the possibility of, you know, of this sort of area of eroticism.
right, which and I feel like that's really what makes it work, because if it was entirely, because you get the sense that, okay, this is a lonely girl and she's being, and the relationship is predatory and it is abusive, but you know, because it's a very, she's very creepy. She does the whole love bombing thing.
Yes,
um
she is in fact the classic anime 500-year-old witch in a 15-year-old girl's body
right.
with
And
concomitant, you know, power dynamics.
right, yes, including like starting this when she's a very little kid, like teleporting into her room or like psychically dream preying on her or something.
Is that how you interpreted that? I thought that the sort of the nature of the dream stuff was a bit ambiguous, but
I know, I think it is. I think it was like some sort of psychic, you know, sort of establishing a psychic link, almost like she's trying to, you know, almost like Carmilla is planning ahead of time and wants to set up this like soulmates idea, wants to plant that seed in her mind.
interesting. The vampire hunters do make a point that like that Carmilla has a distinction between her sort of favorite victims and like food, who are like the peasants that she just sort of goes out and eats.
Yes, which isn't that a great little bit of social commentary right there? Like you've got these peasant girls wasting away right and left while, you know, Carmilla is sort of clinging to Laura and kissing her and telling her how much, oh, I love you and only you. And you cannot love anybody but me. And nobody notices.
Yeah, nobody in the big house cares that
Right.
you know all of these peasant girls are dying. You know, it's probably some peasant disease or peasant misadventure that's causing it to happen. You know?
Right, exactly. And you know, which again I think does actually tie into your point that all these male authority figures are supposed to be creepy and not necessarily not entirely have Laura's best interest at heart, because otherwise they would have noticed all the peasant girls dying and, you know, made some connections possibly.
Yeah. I think that it's fun to swing into the biography of the actual author as we do this. Because John Sheridan Le Fanu, or Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu was Irish, as the famous playwright Sheridan was. The Le Fanu comes from Huguenot ancestry. Huguenot? I don't know. He was a Irish Protestant who was raised Protestant by sort of by his like Calvinist father in Dublin, and this was during the time of the famine. And he spent his early years writing essentially about the cultural genocide of Catholics in Ireland. But when he sort of but these obviously weren't selling very well in England. So at sort of the age of 30 or so, he after consulting with a friend was like, okay, I'm going to write for English people. And that's when he started writing ghost stories.
Fascinating.
And he started writing like ghost stories set in England and elsewhere outside of Ireland. And he wrote a series of what were at the time called sensation novels, which are basically Victorian literature, which clothes like, you know, social issues of the time in like supernatural vibes. Like he wrote a story, you know, speaking of like, you know, the sort of the basic idea of the horror genre being sort of looking into actual, you know, social fears and you know, making them supernatural. He wrote a story in which a man drinks too much green tea, and this opens his third eye and allows him to see this horrible like mystical monkey monster who is hounding him. So the guy is conscious of class issues, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
The guy's very, very conscious of class and power issues as he's going into this. So I don't think that this is by accident that this sort of, you know, upstairs, downstairs stuff is being discussed.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So how did you read the dream sequence in her early childhood?
I was thinking, at that time, because I hadn't read the rest of the story yet. Maybe she's already been preyed on by a vampire, so maybe she'll turn out to be a vampire? Question mark.
That would have
Which is
been
not
cleverly metatextual, but no.
no. But I also I didn't necessarily think that somewhere else, Carmilla was sending her these dreams when she was young. But possibly more that it was sort of indicative of, it meant to be indicative of similar desire within herself, which made her a particularly interesting, made her the love kind of prey rather than the, just food kind of prey for Carmilla. And this idea that, if Carmilla had been left to her own devices, Laura might have ended up being turned rather than just killed.
Yeah.
But, by whatever, means that connection took place, I didn't really have an answer for it, but I think that's plausible what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think either could work. The
But yeah, it's intentionally ambiguous.
yeah. So what else can we say about this?
I think that it's like, I'm thinking about locker room detective stories a lot right now, because I'm, as I mentioned in the previous episode jingle, I'm being forced to watch Umineko by my wife. It turns out Umineko is actually good. With a lot of caveats. And this actually is very this is very like Umineko, says the guy who is reading Umineko and has Umineko on the brain. But Umineko is a very, 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 very long visual novel, which is mostly about, which is in part a deconstruction of detective stories, and particularly of locked room detective stories, and what is the point of locked room detective story when magic is real?
Right, because I mean, that Gideon the Ninth pulls it off fairly well.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's no answer to that. There's no one answer to that question. It's a very, very long text, but the point being that there's sort of the same kind of seed is in here, because it's the author who is living through the heyday of detective fiction, right? Where the sort of the locked room mystery is one of the de rigueur magazine genres, right? Genre stories is being we're careful to point out that all of these doors are locked and the windows are locked, and she couldn't have gone from this point to that point. There's no rational explanation for her going from this point to that point. And it's not because there's a clever sort of detective story, in here. It's because she's magic.
Right.
And so it turns out that it's a different kind of story altogether, but there's this sort of misdirection in there initially that I think is intentional, that, is this a detective story? Is there actually a murderer prowling about the way that Carmilla, pretends there is?
That's interesting. I mean, that would not have occurred to me. I think because I came to this book already understanding its place in the culture, so I was already
right.
And so it did, but you're right. I mean, there weren't books like this necessarily before, because this is the first. And so, yes, obviously, this could be a detective where the end to the mystery is actually it's a vampire.
Right,
this creature from folklore that, you probably haven't ever even heard of before.
Indeed, or the umpire, as
umpire.
as the Poles have it, apparently. What did you think of Carmilla's mother and attendant?
That whole thing was really interesting, because she shows up and is this sort of way of introducing her, she shows up first as a plot device and then sort of vanishes. And then she shows up again as the same kind of plot device in the flashback when, the general or baron or whatever he is trying to catch up with her. But then we never really find out what's up with her or the attendant. They're just, they find the one vampire and kill her, but her mother vampire is still out there?
Yeah, the impression that I sort of got from, or at least my sort of reading of this is that because much is made of how, she herself, the actual vampire lady, is very robust and, pink, right?
Right.
And sexy, because it's important that she be a sexy vampire for reasons that we've gone over.
Yes.
But her mom is, largely masked or very pale from shock, we think, initially, right?
Right.
And the retainer is also extremely pale and weird. I think they're supposed to be thralls. I think they're supposed to be like her servant, her undead servants, not actually vampires in and of themselves.
See, that makes sense for the one retainer, but the thing is that for the mother is really independent and clever at flirting with and teasing and convincing the what's his face, the general, that that she knows him, and that they've flirted before. And so, I mean, it could be that they're thralls, and the reason why, and so they're not a loose end in the plot because, when the vampire's gone, so are they. But at the same time, she's a remarkably independent, active, thinking thrall, which makes me wonder. And also, where did you get Carmilla from in the first place? She may have been a suicide. We don't know.
The good witch must have good furniture, and that's another Umineko thing, and I apologize.
I was about to ask,
but Carmilla herself is the 15, the countess who's been dead for and so if she needs. She's going to appear as this alluring 15-year-old, but, she can't just be an alluring 15-year-old wandering around. She needs, these props.
Yes.
Uh-huh. And, the horses are real. The cart is real. The horses keep fucking collapsing. I thought, actually, a thing that I was expecting the Machado to point out, which she doesn't, was that the horses first collapse at the side of a cross. Which suggests that they are also demonic in some way.
Vampire horses, yes.
Vampire, why not?
Why
Vampire
not?
Horses. I actually liked that Carmilla's aversion to sort of religious stuff was like the hymn. That's not something I've ever seen in.
Yeah, it's usually just the cross.
The cross is, or but no, it's the piety. It's not the piety of the symbol, because presumably there are crosses in their house, right?
Right.
Because this is, a household of the time. It would be typical for them to have religious ornamentation around. Mm-hmm. But it's the act of religious piety and that is what, turns her off so thoroughly. Which makes me think that having a crucifix sewn into the tabard of the Jewish hunchback wouldn't even have worked under the story's own logic.
Right.
I don't know how carefully Carmen read this story. It's sort of the problem.
I mean, that was certainly that one was a pretty big thing to overlook. I really think that I sometimes wonder if everything else in this is just the introduction, every other annotation is all just a justification for pointing out the one scene that's definitely an orgasm.
Yeah, no, I feel like that was the starting point, and that things went from there. It's like, oh, I mean, because it is interesting, right? It's like, okay, so what are the symptoms of of being attacked by a vampire at night. First, you feel this cold wind on your breast. Sure, makes sense. Cold breath of the vampire on your breast. Then the pinpricks and sort of the lassitude that comes from anemia and loss of blood. Sure, makes sense. But then the sense of strangulation? Where did that come from, you know?
Well, but the thing is that, and this is another thing that our, annotator missed, is that that's also exactly what Carmilla goes through when she hears the hymn.
Right.
She gets the strangling, she gets the, she starts shuddering until a cry, and like clenches up, and then a cry bursts out of her. Like, it's the exact same, escalation of sensations, observed from the outside instead of the inside. But it's the same thing, which I think is this really interesting mirror in the text. And if you want to read what happens to Laura later as an orgasm, which is a pretty obvious, sensible reading, then what is going on with Carmilla and the hymn?
Well, that is very interesting, because it makes it like, it locates sex in a particular place, right? Which would make sense coming from a sort of Victorian / Calvinist background. Like the sort of the thing that both attracts and repulses. For a vampire, like listening to a hymn, it hurts her because she's a demon, but there's that like leftover longing for life, and purity, one might say. And so it gives you the old internal contradiction, which is what I'll be calling an orgasm from now on. But it has that sort of unwitting physical being sucked into something that is calling you in a way that you don't want, sort of a feeling, in much the same way that that Maria has that feeling when she is preyed upon by Carmilla. That would be my sort of spitball take as to what that would signify.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, that's a really great catch. The what's the word that I want? The symmetry there between those two reactions.
Yeah, and I think you're right that it's this sort of, in both cases, it's about the sort of attraction, repulsion, tension.
Which is very much sort of Maria's default state throughout the book. Because Laura's, sorry, yeah. Names.
Yes, nobody involved in this is actually goes by Maria, and yet you've called several people Maria.
Okay, so West Side Story jingle here.
Right. That or how do you solve a problem like Maria?
Oh, actually, that's much better, isn't it? I'll see which one is easier to play on the guitar.
All right.
Maria, I just can't stop saying Maria. And maybe it's because there's a character by that name in Umineko. Maria. How do you solve this problem?
So actually, this is just a tiny little note, but it's something that I thought was interesting. So when I was reading this on Shabbos, so I couldn't, make notes, but instead I just had some multicolored little Post-its that I would stick in right at the word or something that I thought was interesting and wanted to return to. Almost all of which I have no idea why I put them there.
Awesome. This is very similar to my note-taking then.
Yes. Except that, it'd be useful if I could have at least written down a word or two. But in this case, I do remember this one because I remember thinking, oh, I need to check and see, is that really the original language? Where it just goes, and she never emerged from her room till the afternoon was pretty far advanced.
And yes, I believe that is the initial.
It is. Yeah. It is the original. It's just, that use of pretty to me like that is something that that sounds so modern. Mm-hmm. I just enjoy this as an example of something which really has retained a very modern sounding cadence, which is actually, I think, an example of the ways in which this book, there's not actually that much in this book which, does not, it reads much more like modern prose than somebody who would be trying to write this doing it as a literary conceit.
Right. I mean, this guy's is essentially contemporaneous with Dickens. They expect us to read Dickens, This guy's no more or less comprehensible than Dickens.
I think, like, honestly, I feel like this reads to me more like modern English than Dickens in some ways, possibly because
Well,
it's
yeah,
trying
because he's
so
not
hard.
trying to read by the right, being paid by the word in the same
I don't
way.
know, because
Although
I mean,
guess
this
he
one is
was.
serial, right? Like this was also a
Right.
serialized novel.
This still manages to be quite short.
So
It's not even. It's a short. It's the size of a short story. He eventually publishes it as like with four others as a not as like a collection,
yeah, I mean, this is a novella.
including the green tea one.
Like this is novella length,
Yeah.
and
But regardless, yeah, no, I find his original prose less impenetrable than Charles Dickens. So,
Right.
why do we need to update it?
honestly, I too am excessively fond of commas, so do not think that there's any reason to erase them. Actually, let's talk about the seriality. Partly because I read an interesting book proposal for talking about like the importance of seriality as a medium, and this is in Korean literature. But because one of the things you would expect is that every chapter ends on a cliffhanger. And they don't necessarily, or at least they don't end on the kind of things that we would think of as cliffhangers. Often they end on like a bit of foreshadowing.
This is true. Do we know that it's chapter by chapter it was serialized? Because there's a great deal of difference in length between the chapters.
I
And
don't
again, if we
know.
had a critical condition, it would be. But yeah,
I don't know.
I do
The
have a
thing is
critical
that-
condition, and it's a lack of a critical condition.
Um,
Isaac can't speak English today.
the thing is that, just because something is serialized, especially in sort of earlier eras, just because something is serialized doesn't mean that it was, the exact same size and released on a regular basis. There's a fascinating thing where to get around Japanese censors, colonial Korean literature that was serialized would sometimes wait a few days, just like skip a couple days of publication, figuring that the censors would have forgotten what happened in the previous episode at that point. But they couldn't wait too many days because then the censors would start to suspect that something was up. Like this was actually, so which just made me think about, okay, well, seriality is a tool to evade censorship, but also, which does make me wonder if that did also allow this. I mean, this is a very sexy vampire story.
That's true.
And it is much more sort of overtly lesbian than I would have expected the first time I read it. And I do wonder if the fact that each one was coming in a different, that each one is coming in a different installment, and each installment is ending on this note of foreboding that's like this signaling of, don't worry, everything is going to go bad. I'm not endorsing this behavior.
Yes, I mean, well, this is also the Victorian era where things were in fact much filthier than we give them credit for, just like slightly out of the way. And I think that this is probably, again, I'm just spitballing here because I don't have any of the context. But
Well, we can't complain that much because we could have gone out and checked out the critical editions ourselves.
I suppose we could have, yes, but perhaps maybe this magazine was a bit of a boundary pusher, a bit of an envelope pusher, sort of a Penny Dreadful, Blood and Thunder kind of.
It was called The Dark Blue.
Yes, which suggests that forbidden delights may wait within.
I wonder if blue. Now this is just a random etymology thing. I wonder if blue had that connotation back then.
This is an anecdote which I'm almost certainly going to edit out.
Okay.
But there was recently a VTuber was speculating about why the blue VTubers in her company seem to be doing the best in all the branches, like the ones that are sort of blue themed outfits and coloring.
Oh, okay. So you don't mean blue.
Well, no, I don't.
Color.
Yeah, I just mean specifically color, like Gargura and Suisse, and these various people all have sort of blue motifs. And somebody said, "Oh, in English, blue means has sexual connotations, where in Japanese it doesn't." And maybe that's
Japanese, it's pink.
Exactly. Kaori herself happens to be pink, which is maybe why this was brought up. And the comments on this were like, I've never heard of this. Who's teaching Koyori English slang from the 1940s? I think that this already doesn't really have currency anymore. But it would be interesting to go back and see if that's. I'm guessing. Actually, you know what? I think based on some other things I've read that it would have had currency at this point.
Well, I do have, through my work, access to the OED. So if you remind me later, I can just VPN into work and check this out.
Excellent.
And then you can do a jingle about it if it turns out to be something interesting.
Yeah, why not? We're kind of spinning our wheels here at this point. Might as well just keep that in. The OED says the use of blue from scene dates back to 1824 at least. By the way, did you know that all of the blue girls from Hololive are performing at Dodger Stadium on July 5th, and Garger is gonna sing Take Me Out to the Ball Game during the 7th inning stretch. This episode comes out on... Yep, it happened 2 days ago. But yeah, no, serialization. I think that it is interesting. If in fact it was chapter by chapter that it was serialized, that would make sense why the doctor's like reveal of what the plot is broken up over 3 chapters of like 2 pages each. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really make sense from a structural perspective, but from a tune in next time perspective, it certainly does.
Right, yeah. And I mean, I don't know, and presumably there was some degree of editing that happened when converting it from the serial version to this, to the, single volume version. But
I think that like I think that talking about serialization is very interesting because of the internet, we're sort of back to an era of serialization that almost vanished.
Yes.
Like with webcomics and web novels. And in fact, visual novels, Umineko came out chapter by chapter.
Yes.
But yeah, we're seeing sort of a resurgence of that and the narrative, that surrounds that. And one of the big issues with serial narrative is readers of our listeners of our Homestuck episode might be aware is that you can't edit.
No, you're right. You're right. I'm just sighing, recount, just resetting the counter,
resetting the Homestuck counter. But it's a very pertinent example in this case. It's like, if you're particularly if you don't have like an external like magazine editor looking over your shoulder, like if your pacing happens to go completely cattywampus, and you have a captive audience of people who are interested in how to turn out, there's no end of opportunity for like massive crimes against structure and pacing to take place.
Yes, and and then unlike the present day, because it's interesting with webcomics, for example, I don't actually know much about web novels. With webcomics, they don't there's very little editing that usually happens between the webcomic version and the volume version. You'd expect there to be a lot more, because that would be a sort of a form of bonus content. Perhaps it's just because they would have to go back and redraw it. But they.
Although some people do.
That's true. Some people do.
Some people do it repeatedly, which is its own particular kind of monomania. But
right, but in that case, that's people usually going back and redrawing the actual comic, not just redrawing a panel here and cutting a strip here and adding a strip there to make it flow better in the book version that they're kickstarting.
Exactly. It's more of I started this when I was 15
right.
and didn't know what I was doing, so let's try to make the beginning look at least remotely like the end. I think that sort of this is again untutored because I'm not a web novel person, but I have some friends who are, and it seems like with a lot of web novels, it's like this novel may never be finished, and B, if it is finished, it is usually so long that it would need to be published in like 5 volumes. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that sort of print publication is often the goal, or it's more of like a perk, and generally people, once it's up on the internet, it's up.
Yeah, and I mean American webcomics are generally just a writer and maybe an artist as well. I know that some of the webtoons are done with, much more heavy-handed editorial. The Korean webtoons are sometimes have a little bit more of a heavy-handed editorial involvement because they're not, indie. But it is really interesting that most of the serial literature, word-based, at least potentially print media that we consume, is not done usually under an editorial, like particularly heavy editorial hand in a way that this presumably was. I mean, who knows? But
I don't. I don't have any.
You don't have a critical edition. So
I'm just going to go out and get it after this.
I know, right? Just to find
make
out.
that a postscript in there or something.
That's good. That can be some. So the.
Well, do we have any more thoughts about the story itself or about this presentation?
Well, one thing that I do think is interesting, actually, is that, especially if we're willing to read this with some critical distance, but not both from the story, but also from the contemporary interpretation of, oh, this is just like a story of suppressed gay longing, is that this is also a really good example of how extremely toxic romantic relationship can sometimes be allowed to carry on with no parental involvement because it's just girls being friends. And, if it's just girls, it's not a serious relationship. And thus, there's nobody who's really stepping in to do anything as, Laura's getting sicker and sicker and Carmilla's getting weirder and weirder.
Yeah, no, I think that is 100% true. I think that the characterization of Laura's father here is like, despite the fact that it's literally just them and the servants in the house, and like, what else is he doing with his life? He basically doesn't pay any attention.
I get the impression that he kind of did, sort of, before Carmilla came along, and that Carmilla shows up and he's a little bit relieved. He's like, oh, good, now I don't have to like sit through all these boring conversations with my daughter, who's too young to be interesting. And of course, there is also, because there's so much about how incredibly alone she is, and it's just her and her father and like all of these servants.
Of course, there is that as well. You would not believe how isolated I am. It's just me and father and, and Mademoiselle and all the servants.
Yes. And I don't want to be like, oh, what's actually interesting about this, early lesbian literature example is the class consciousness. But it is an interesting thing because I think you're right that some of this might actually be, more deliberate than one might think just if you're just reading it as a product of its time. And so part of that is, well, okay, the servants aren't, have no way of intervening. They fuss a lot, but they can't really do anything except, they're the ones who go, oh my God, we can't find Carmilla. Like they're,
right.
And
they're the ones who notice Carmilla walking around outside. They say, oh, it's haunted because we keep seeing this girl walking around.
Right,
and like, nobody takes any of that seriously because it's just the servants.
Right, and because like it's not like they can say, oh, by the way, your house guest is wandering around at 4 a.m. in the garden. That would get you fired. Right. And so, but it is because you see that like all the authority figures fail her until it's almost too late.
Yes.
And until it is too late for, the girl who was going to be her best friend before, Carmilla drained her life away and then took her place. Where, Laura was so excited to have this companion, and then this companion dies, and then this other girl shows up to take her place.
All according to Keikaku one.
Right, but it's, you've got all of these men who are very specifically scholars and intellectuals and folklorists, and they're all just so completely useless to a degree that.
Hell, one of them deliberately made it worse by hiding Marcel's headstone.
So it's that again. This feels like it's got to be deliberate commentary, and that and there's not really. Because again, to sort of return to my initial comment about the ambivalence, there's no real sense of condemnation for any of Laura's feelings, like Laura's attraction to Carmilla and, and deep connection and lingering nostalgia and the fact that, she spends the rest of her short life, like, listening for her, footstep at the door. But there's not even that much of a sense of, the ways in which she is damaged by this love affair are very specifically because her blood is being drained. And there's, there's this sort of lingering emotional damage, but it doesn't, there's no sin attached. There's no, I mean, obviously I'm not exactly the best person to comment on whether or not this aligns with Christian ideas of sin, but she never feels dirty, and the narrative never treats her as if she's dirty, even as she's been, kissing the vampire girl and never really quite getting over her.
Right. And it's like none of the even none of the like the experts that are called in are like, say that she's unclean.
Right, which is very different from Dracula,
right.
where, Mina is very specifically, gets burned by the cross even when she's just starting to be turned.
Mm-hmm. This feels less conservative than Bram Stoker's take, like in a lot of ways.
Yes, well, less conservative, but also just less, it's less moralistic. It almost feels like the moral isn't, avoid sexy, dangerous foreigners. It's more, if the sexy, dangerous foreigners start mistreating you, then you should go murder them.
Yeah. I also, like, speaking of the class thing, I think it's one of the weirder changes that Machado makes is that in her edit, the house that Maria lives in is called a manor.
Laura.
God fucking damn it! What
is
is
it
wrong
Laura
with my
or Carmilla?
brain?
Which one are you talking about? I don't know.
Laura. I'm talking about Laura.
Okay.
I'm just going to take that again because now that the joke has already been made, that's just embarrassing.
Okay.
One of the stranger changes that Machado makes is that the house that that Laura and her father live in is called a manor in this edition, but in the original it is called a castle, a schloss. And it is an actual castle. It has a moat and a drawbridge.
Right.
So, and I don't see why you wouldn't call it a castle. Because we know what a castle is. You don't have to pretend that it's not a castle that they're living in. And that further heightens the fact that this is the castle and there's the village, and the stuff is happening in the castle, as it often does in these, vampire stories.
But the deaths are happening in the village.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So yeah, I don't know why that change was made.
I have no idea.
Possibly to redirect attention from the class element to the to the sex element. But who knows? So are we then finished with our discussion?
I think so.
Yeah, I think this was a fun investigation.
Yeah, and I guess. Do we see, what elements of this do we see? Because this is always a fun thing to do with retro, right? What elements of this do we see that have lasted? I mean, obviously, the Wicked and the Willing, including the deep ambivalence. Like, that was one of the things that I really enjoyed about the Wicked and the Willing. And that is very much in this tradition.
Yeah, no, the vampire is still sexy. Even if
But it's not a matter of still sexy. It's very specifically... These are examples of vampire narratives where the attraction of the abusive relationship is made just as clear, is depicted just as unflinchingly as the inevitable destruction.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right there.
And that, I think, that is not necessarily something... I mean, I think that is something that we are seeing that we're starting to sort of see come back a little bit right now as there's been more of an appetite for horrible toxic relationships, including let our lesbians be toxic and awful again. And because if part of being able to do that is feeling like you can show this really awful, destructive relationship and give equal time to why, what is it that made it this compelling to the person? Because otherwise it's just mind control, and that's not nearly so interesting. I guess unless you have a mind control fetish, in which case presumably it is. But so I think that is one thing that we see in this. But
yeah, I would agree. And yeah. I don't know what else there is to bring forward in it, except we're still doing the Jewish stereotypes for some reason.
Right. Okay. Yes, that. This one, I feel like we've updated it a little bit, but
Yes. Generally no longer hunchback.
Yeah. God.
Yes. So.
All right. So I've lost track of where we are and what we're doing next. And now I've had and as of last episode, which I think is actually going to air after this one, I had the shattering realization that you were not going back and editing in what we're doing next.
So next episode to come up will be The Spirit Cuts Through Water, but the one that we're recording next, which will come out after The Spirit Cuts Through Water.
It's someone you can build a nest in.
Is someone you can build a nest in, which is the rare book that you thought was bad and I didn't.
I didn't think it was bad. I thought it did some things very well, and some things really aligned with my pet peeves. We'll just put it that way.
Indeed, I do have you in 4K saying it was bad at the end of the Spirit Goes Through Water episode, but be that as it may.
Well, okay.
But
I've moderated my tone. We will figure it out. It will be a fun time for all.
They actually called it an interesting failure, which I would probably hate. I didn't hate it, but it might be an interesting failure nonetheless, which reminds me of this week's podcast, where we ironically spend a lot of time talking about our own preoccupations rather than the text in front of us. Does that remind you of anyone? Nobody here is free of sin. Incidentally, there is a critical edition of Carmilla, which I bought, and I read the introduction, but I haven't gotten into the essays yet because they're all very long, and now I'm showing why this edition was probably a little bit more successful. Oh, this one was a rough one, guys.